I have absolutely zero fundraising uh, experience. I have scavenging experience, which is how we do things around these parts where no one has any money. So we just try to find everything that we might possibly need. But I know we're going to need, I know there is money available for various initiatives, and I think more and more is becoming available from the university. So I'm looking to hear sort of some of your experiences, because I have none, and see what other people are doing, and trying to figure out how to do that without having to sell our souls.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, SJ. And we'll move over to Jada. So where you're from and your campus funding situation and experience or goals.
Okay. Can you hear me? It's really... My computer is done. Okay, there we go. Yes, my name is Jada. I'm at Dalhousie. Basically, I'm similar to Sarah Jane in that I'm good at scavenging. And I know how to, like, personally, like, where to ask for money, but I've never actually, like, fundraised. So I'm not necessarily, like, a huge knowledge pot of that.
But you're currently involved with funding for positions through the Sustainability Union, or sorry, the Dalhousie Students Union and the Sustainability Office.
Yes, actually, I met with the Dalhousie Student Union exec today, the president and colonel, for positions, and they're going to talk to their finance officer to see if there's enough money. And yeah, I'm getting money from the Sustainability Office as well.
Okay. Awesome. So I think that's Les at Memorial.
Yes, hello. My fundraising experience comes from, well, we just finished up a grant proposal for the Impact Grant conference you went to. Other than that, my fundraising experiences have been limited. I did a lot of fundraising when I was working with the Canadian Improv Games for different groups with them. But mostly that was less going to community members and applying for funding through that stuff, and more so relying on parents with money or businesses that could sponsor events. So it's a little bit of a different experience. So trying to learn how to approach community members and try to get them to fund different stuff would be a really beneficial thing to get out of this call.
And the final person on the call today is Melanie from UNBC.
That was my job. Hi, I'm Melanie from UNBC in Prince George.
Yeah. No, I remember seeing some really amazing pictures of you for the UNBC grant that Sarah and I were helping edit. Little
the
potato.
epic.
So, yeah.
Thanks. That picture is going everywhere. Yeah, so again, like most other people here, I have very limited grant writing skills or funding procurement skills. Our money mainly from on campus mainly comes from our Green Fund, which is housed through our Sustainability Office and is sourced from our parking levy. So all those fees go towards student grant applications. And so this year I successfully, well, almost successfully, we've filled three grant applications that have been passed so far, so they just have to be approved from our executive committee. That's my experience in a nutshell.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, so now if we go back to that document, so right at the top, there's a bunch of resources that I'm just going to quickly overview for you. We're not going to get into too much detail, but just so you do have them available. So the first one is a fundraising blog post for how to fundraise specifically for the National Student Food Summit, and it talks about a bunch of different potential funders and how to approach them. We then have a more thorough how to fundraise guide, which talks about how to write a successful proposal and different steps, and it's really generally applicable, and it should be really helpful. Then we have a fundraising letter example. So if you're approaching community businesses or community members for sponsorship to attend the summit, that's something that you can reuse. You just have to tailor it to CFSP and yourself and your own experiences. We've given you a sample sponsorship package. So that's the package that we use to get over $20,000 of sponsorship for the National Student Food Summit, which is just a really great example of how to use and how to create an effective sponsorship package. We've included a couple grants that you can look over as samples. So the first one is the Epicure grant, which was from UNBC, which we thought was great. And then I have an internal university grant, which was for the campus community garden that I started. And then we have some general fundraising resources. So an online fundraising guide, which is specifically about using crowdsourcing and crowdfunding. So that's actually sort of a new area of student fundraising that I found to be really effective. And then Fundraising 101 for board members, which has some really cool tips. A case for support for meal exchange. So if you're doing work that revolves around meal exchange, there's really good statistics from that. And then an example letter of agreement, which is something that I discovered coming to meal exchange that I wish I'd had for all my years of fundraising, because it really pares down what you're getting out of a partnership, and it ensures that there's an agreement on what the contributions are, because I can't tell you how many times I've had an agreement with a sponsor or funder where they haven't followed through because their expectations weren't made clear.
Any questions about those resources at this point? There's a lot there, and we can always follow up on it.
Yeah, are they all located in any particular folder, or are they just in this document?
So they're all hosted on Box, and they're all linked to on this document. If you'd like, we can potentially look at putting them into a Google Drive folder so that you can have access to them down the line without having to go to this agenda.
Yeah, or putting them on studentfood.ca. We can create a page for funding.
No, this is okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's a good idea. And we can create a page on studentfood.ca. So one thing that we're hoping to do down the line is actually create a fundraising guide for campus organizations and students so we can put together a toolkit. So if there's anything that comes out of this call or any thoughts that you have on things that I haven't addressed, I would love to hear them. So moving right along, we're basically structured this call as sort of a what types of funding exist, who do you go for to get it, and how do you get it. So I just wanted sort of like a thumbs up, thumbs down on if you like that approach or if you want to go in a different direction.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Okay. So in terms of types of funding that exist, if you go to the page, there's a huge giant list, and I'm just sort of going to read them, and then if you have any comments or stories you want to share, please bring them up. So the first type of funding that exists for students, and sort of the most common one, is organizational funding. So clubs get funding through their student union, through a student activity fee, and that's distributed to different clubs and organizations on campus. The second one is a levy. So this is a fee that's put onto all students' tuition, basically. That's collected into a pool of money. You can start a new levy, or you can rely on an existing levy. So parking funds are kind of like a levy, in a sense. And then membership fees. So if you're a campus organization and you actually have members participating in your organization, it's not all that uncommon to charge them $5 or $10 to get a membership card, which would give them access to events and funding. The second type of funding that's really useful for students is sponsorship. So that's sort of either product sponsorship, so getting a donation from a local business or a local farm, or monetary sponsorship, and that's in return for advertising and generation of positive public relations for them. The third type of funding is project-based grants. So these can be internal grants or external grants. Universities have been taking a lot of initiative to create student initiative funds and opportunities for students to apply for grants. And if you go to your student union or your student affairs department, student life department, they usually know about what's available. So if you aren't aware of ones on your campus, you can sort of ask and find out where those exist. There's also external grants. So those are ones that Meal Exchange can help you out with a lot, and we're going to talk about some different external funders later on in the call. There's event-based funding. So if you've ever hosted sort of a concert or a pub night, that's a really effective way to raise funds for campuses. If you're doing any sort of event where you're serving food, you can sort of do a pay what you can collection if you don't want to do anything that will create a barrier, or you can just charge a basic admission. There are some really cool fundraising events that we've seen students do. So one example that I really love is Bang for a Buck. So students actually approached a local junkyard and got a donated car towards midterm season, and basically offer students the opportunity to beat the crap out of it for $1 to $10, depending on what tool they got. So if you had $1, you could hit it with a hammer. If you had $5, you could whack it with a sledgehammer. If you had $10, you could go with like a chainsaw sort of deal.
Wow.
Yeah, and it raises a surprising amount of money, and it's sort of fun to see, like, as the car is destroyed, just the various stages. The next one is sort of individual monetary donations. So this is something that comes from friends, family, community members, and this can be solicited through an online campaign, an event, or an in-person ask. I find that crowdfunding tools are a really effective way to do this for students because it gets rid of that fear about accountability of a cash donation. And often these services can offer charitable receipts and receipts if you're linked up with another organization for you, and it just simplifies your whole process, and it sort of allows you to set campaign goals and be really broad in the way you market them. So you can use social media, you can send them out through email, and it just sort of creates a nice straightforward way of being like, this is how much we've raised so far, this is how close we are to our goal.
And just so you guys know, the Sierra Youth Coalition has a page called the Education Fund. So if you ever have a project that you want to have donations for, we have a page that will give donors a charitable receipt, which is what some donors want. So that's an option that we can talk through.
Yeah. The next form of funding that you can receive is partnership-derived funding. So this is one that's really helpful for students. So partnering with other organizations that do have funding that wouldn't necessarily give you a monetary donation, but could do something like in-kind labor. So if you're working on a campus community garden, for example, having someone from the grounds department or facilities management and planning department actually go through and till the soil, erect a fence, provide you with materials. Or if you're hosting any sort of social event, partnering with another campus organization that has funding. So a similar club, a similar student union, and just splitting the costs. And then the last form of funding that I find is really useful for students is position-based funding. So work study funding through the university, co-ops, and Canada Summer Jobs are just really great ways that you can get funding to fund your projects. So are there any questions or any interest in diving into any of those types of funding a little bit more? Okay. So I'm getting like a long silence here.
All good?
All good.
So that's just a broad spectrum of like everything that's possible. We can kind of dig into how. So
yeah.
This is the sort of the many pots of gold that exist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've done sort of the what exists, so we can now go into sort of where it exists. So places that you can access funding as a student that are really useful are your student union. So student unions provide that organizational funding that I was talking about earlier. They can provide partnerships on events, and they can offer sponsorship on occasion, as well as grants. So, for example, my student union has a green grant program. School administration are great funders. They usually have student initiative funds that take some form or another, or discretionary funds that can help support your initiative. So if you wanted to attend the National Student Food Summit, for example, you could pitch the idea of, I'm going to go to this campus and bring back XYZ. The next one is sustainability offices / sustainability levy groups. So these are people that really want to support your projects and initiatives that sometimes will have funding available, or will start a collection of funding. So with UNBC, the parking levy is a great example of how a sustainability office is creating money for environmental projects. And that's actually not uncommon on campuses. So I know like UBC has a sustainability fund, U of T has an environmental resource network, and if these don't exist, it's great to sort of try and create them. Next is sort of ground / facilities management and planning, and I sort of talked about this with the garden, so getting in-kind labor donations. That can be really super helpful. And then foundations, which I'm going to pass off to Sarah to give you an example of like good foundations that CFSP and SYC have access in the past.
Yeah, so something for some of the bigger projects, and I think on most of the campuses that are present today, we've helped support external foundations. So this is for grants that not only will contribute to campus, but will also contribute to a national movement or the community where they're based. So community foundation grants are ones that we work with a lot, but there's a lot of other opportunities out there. or they may be associated with academic connections, or something that's associated with, for example, TD, Friends of the Environment, or the Community Foundations of Canada grants. So what happens with this is when there's like a project or something that you guys want to see realized through a foundation, they often require a charitable number. So this is where SIC or Meal Exchange as national organizations can help leverage our charitable status to be able to realize your projects. And that process, as many of you know, is sort of like a collaborative one where we work on grants together, make sure that the goals are in line with your campus, but then also sort of draw in some of the resources from the national network and the national scope. And a really useful piece in that that we can provide is a lot of in-kind support. So as James will speak about in a little bit, the budgets for grants are really, really important. And if we can sort of say, you know, your Canada summer job position being actually part of the in-kind support that we provide, it ends up being, you know, $15,000 of extra funding that we can find by providing a connection and a collaborative grant. So that's something, you know, if you have some projects in mind, let us know, and we can always have our ears to the ground on what's out there. Or if you go out and find a grant, that's something, and I know many of you have done this before, you know, come to us, or sometimes this is what's happened at UNB. You know, we saw a really exciting grant, and we went out and said, would you like to do something? Because we've been approached by them to connect in. So that's something that we can help provide always.
I just want to highlight TD Friends of the Environment Fund is a fund that's really friendly to students because they don't actually require a federal registration number, and their priorities are basically youth and environment, so it's a really natural connection for CFSP. In terms of other places you can find funding, so looking for product sponsors, local businesses are really good, especially within the university community. So if there's a local restaurant that's relying on students as their clientele, you can approach them and saying, would you consider sponsoring our event? We'll put your logo on posters and stuff, and we'll sort of draw more students to your location and build up a positive brand. Corporations are a place that you can approach for funding. I've included food service providers here as a potential corporation that actually is really supportive of students more than you would actually think. So if you're looking for food for your event, for example, and you're able to, sorry, we've lost ourselves. If you're looking for food for an event, or you're looking for sort of support in terms of finding a location and conference services, food service providers are actually really helpful, and I found them to be really supportive. And then corporations like banks give away a ton of money, as do communications companies, so like Rogers, TELUS, they're good funders.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just to hop on that, SYC has a lot of corporate sponsorship regulations and sort of places that we will accept money and places that we won't. So if you're wanting to be a bit stricter with where you're standing on money, we have a corporate screening process that I can pass along. If you'd like to say, you know, we don't support places that support arms or drugs, or, you know, certain specific mining, there's a couple of specific ones that we can pass along.
No, and that's absolutely something that you should be thinking about when you're accepting a sponsor. You want to make sure that you're not going to turn off your event participants or ruin your own image by accepting sponsorship from, say, BP or Monsanto. And you can sort of determine at your own level what's appropriate in terms of sponsorship. So if your students don't like Chartwells and you get Chartwells as a sponsor, that might be a problem. And that's actually something we're going to be discussing at the National Student Food Summit this year. We're going to talk about corporate sponsorship in the campus food movement and where we want to go in terms of directions and where those sponsors fit and where they don't fit. So last place that I sort of highlighted in terms of places to seek funding is faculty and academic departments. So for the most part, these groups tend to fund graduate students, but they can also fund undergraduates, especially if your project aligns well with the department. And they can also sponsor work studies on occasion. Okay, so are there any of those wheres that people want to dive a bit more into, or should we move on?
Yeah, you were talking about undergraduate opportunities within academic departments.
So the way that I would normally approach an academic department is find a real person, so find a professor If you can form a relationship with the chair of the department, that's usually the best way to go because they have the most power and leverage in terms of accessing funds. And then the department itself will often have discretionary funding, so you approach them and say, I'm working on this project that could potentially be an independent study, or it could be a project that would provide long-term benefits to students. So if you're doing your community kitchen or community garden, for example, that might have applied research opportunities to the department down the line. They're really nice people to approach, and I find professors are also really enthusiastic about seeing students, and office hours tend to go unused at a lot of universities, so if you can find the office hour for the chair, and sort of go in and have that initial conversation, it can be a great way to sort of build a relationship and also build a way of accessing funds.
Especially in some smaller universities or smaller communities, professors will be strong advocates for local groups. I know that a lot of professors that we worked at Carleton sit on the board of a couple of food organizations in town, so they can also provide really useful groups.
Does that answer your question, or do you have any more inquiries specific to academic departments?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, all right, we're going to move on. Sorry, Lexi, go right ahead. Oh, sorry, was that Amanda?
Sarah Jane.
Oh.
So many different names.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm hoping to meet. Sort of, I've been in contact with the student union, and one of the problems I find is that sort of every year the student union changes. And so, whereas last year I built this relationship with a couple of people, they're all gone. And so now I'm sort of going to the student union kind of like a cold call, even though there are established positions, and we have existed for a while. I'm just wondering, in terms of, like, because we have club funding, but I don't know about anything about doing like event partnerships with the student union and the kind of events that they would do, or whether that might be too specific to the university. I'm not really sure.
No, I mean, I think that's a really common problem that students have with turnover. And working with student unions in particular, one strategy that I've found is really helpful is connecting with the staff at the student unions, because often those are sort of lifelong student politicians who will sit in those positions for 5 to 10 years, sometimes even longer. So where possible, reach out to the student union's executive director or any staff that's likely to sort of have a longer residency time. Exec director is sort of my main point of contact because they will sit for a while and they actually tend to sit on the executive committee and overview all sort of funding decisions. So if you can form a relationship with a staff member at the student union who's going to have a residency time greater than 1 year, that can really benefit you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another maybe option, and is for longer term, but Dalhousie, Sammy from last year went in during the transition period between presidents and kind of had a sit-down meeting with both of them, making sure that her role and her presence was known in that transition time, so which is usually April, like March to May.
So be aware of transition and try and get the contact in as early as possible. So if you have a funding request that's going in September, for example, you might want to go in a couple months before and build that relationship so it doesn't feel like a cold call.
Okay.
Long-term strategies.
Long-term strategies.
Thank you.
It is a little bit difficult, and it's a common problem for students to turn over because people graduate, people leave, people only stay in those student union positions for 1 to 2 years.
I also found that talking to the manager of the student union and like having a good relationship with that person is probably the best because they actually control and have a lot of input on food services.
Is that a full-time? Is that a student position or is that a staff position, Jada?
No, it's not a student position.
Okay. Yeah, so it's again going back to their staff who will stay there for a bit longer and have a little bit more power.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. So one other thing that comes to mind is if you can actually build in a policy with the student union to formalize your partnership, that's one other way of making it longer term. So if your student union, for example, has sort of constitution and bylaws, and you have a really well-established partnership, you can actually work at building that into the constitution or building it into the responsibility as an executive to liaison with your group, depending on what status you have.
And maybe one way to do that is by, looking at their policies too. Often a lot of platforms include food, so sort of seeing like, what is your plan for food and how can the Campus Food Strategy Group help you achieve that goal, and look at similar goals. Maybe there's a social justice rep, or there's an internal rep that's dealing with certain things, sort of comparing it to different policies that are in place.
And I think about a few things regarding the student union. I'm actually sitting in the student union office right now, so I'm like kind of hushing about it. But I mean, a few things I think of, what are the merits or maybe disadvantages of becoming a part of a student union? Would we be able to get more done or less done because of the politics involved with that? Because we have a sustainability person, but we don't have anyone specific to food. But when we're thinking about maybe potentially getting a student levy, is that the only way we'd be able to obtain that is if we become a part of the student union itself? But when you're talking about the Constitution and bylaws, I think here at UMBC we had the student union endorse the National Student Food Charter, but endorsing and adopting and maybe acting on the initiative is a lot different than you would expect. So I feel like there's challenges with each of them that we haven't really been able to grasp.
Yeah, and I mean, when you're adopting something like a policy document, you really want to make sure it's integrated into those key documents. So it's one thing to adopt a policy as a motion and then the motion is quickly forgotten versus putting it into like their key organization documents that sort of dictate the responsibility. So when you're trying to get policies integrated, try and put them into that higher level. Because if it's just an adjunct policy, it gets lost year to year. And I can definitely see that as a challenge, and I definitely think student unions have sort of pros and cons in terms of associations and qualifications and skills and time to dedicate, and sometimes they're reliable, sometimes they're not. With levies...
what do you mean by high level? What do you mean by high level?
Like, sorry, what was it in reference to?
You said...
so at a higher level, So often student unions will have a constitution and bylaws, which dictates their executive responsibilities, how they're getting funding, what their responsibilities are overall. So if you can get it into their like key organizing documents, which is oftentimes their constitution and bylaws, which is something that requires approval at an annual general meeting, that's something that's going to stay with them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but doesn't any policy, or at least for the DSU, the Dalhousie Student Union, any policy that you go through has to go through council and be passed. So I was just wondering, right, vital to be part of the Constitution, or,
Okay. So any policy that's passed isn't necessarily something that sits into their constitution. It's an adjunct policy. If it's sort of like a one-off policy or a one-off endorsement or something, it's something that just sort of exists in the minutes. Whereas if you actually put it into the document that they have to review every year, it's a little bit different, and it's a bit more challenging to get it into those bigger documents. But finding out what those bigger documents are and seeing what possibilities exist is something that I would consider.
What about, because I just wrote policy and gave it to the exec today about having a food board. So if it's like a committee off of council, if they have to review it every year, isn't that like a good step? I don't know. I'm just asking.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a great step. Especially normally committee structures are one of the things that are outlined in constitution and bylaws. So if it goes into that sort of document, that's great. And sort of building a structure to have that sort of committee is awesome.
Okay, cool.
One thing I might just hop on with that came up before was Mel's comment about being sort of locked into one location by one source of funding, and I know this is something that's going to be challenging for most coordinators during the school year, because in the summer, sort of Meal Exchange and Severe Youth Coalition have been able to fund stipends, and also in the summer with Canada Summer Jobs, it's not really attached to anything, so your contracts are pretty open with our summer work plans that we work on together. So I think that's a really good point to raise, and I think James will get into it a little bit more, but you know, making sure that you are really in line with the group that you're partnering with, and if not, is there a way to diversify that funding? And I think Jada later on can explain why you're going with both the Dalhousie Student Union and the Sustainability Office to have a resilient sort of approach to the campus food strategy group.
Yeah, and with levies, I was just going to mention that you can try and create a memorandum of agreement that gives you that sort of independence when you're working out your process. So you can, I've seen levies that exist on campus that are levied through the student union, but they're not run by the student union. If you have an agreement on how that levy is going to work in a way that it's away from the student union, that might be something to look into. So just being conscious of time, I'm hoping we can move on to sort of the how aspect of getting funding, so what the process looks like. So I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough of sort of what it takes to actually get funding, where you start. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is prepare your case for support. So determine what your need is, why your need exists, what you're working on. So I've attached at the top sort of Meal Exchange's case for support. So what funding we need and why we want it and what we're going to do with it is sort of the initial start point. If you look at the How to Fundraise guide, it actually has a whole page talking just about how to form your case for support. And then once you have your case support, you actually look at researching potential funders. So as Sarah mentioned, you really want to look at diversifying your sources of funders and making sure that the funders fit with your organization's missions and goals, and that you're not stretching yourself to try and meet a funder's objectives. And you really want to see what your own objectives are and find a funder that fits well with that. And really don't be afraid to ask a funder if your project is in line with their goals or not, and ask maybe what is a better fit. People often think that funders are too busy or inaccessible, but the reality is, as a funder, if I can form a personal connection with someone who's applying, I'm much more likely to fund them. And I'm more than happy to take that call. That is going to save you a ton of time if you don't fit, and increase the likelihood of your application being successful if you do fit. With funders, don't be afraid to ask. The number one reason people don't get funding is because they don't ask. And always try and make contact with a real person. So this can sometimes be challenging for an external organization, but within campuses, if you can find out who is administering the different grants, it can be really helpful to kind of stalk them and find out, oh, you're going to such and such event, and try and make a personal connection. Where that's not possible, even just sending an email from your personal email address that says, hi, my name is, and I'm thinking about applying for your grant, sort of puts a face to the application and makes it much more likely that it's going to be accepted. Once you've researched your donors and you've reached out to them and you sort of sense what you want to get from them, you start writing your proposal. And your proposal is a lot like a cover letter and resume if you're applying for a job, and it's something that really has to be tailored to each funder's needs and each grant. So make sure that it actually aligns with your funder's objectives. So think about, what does a funder want to get out of fundraising, out of funding you? So if they're a corporation or a business, they're often looking to get advertising and positive public relations, versus a grant is usually tailored more towards, I want to work on this specific problem. So making sure that your proposal reflects that as much as possible. Like a cover letter, keep it short. So 1 to 2 pages for a cover letter. If it's a 15-page cover letter, no employer is going to want to read it. And they often have a lot of applications to get through, so try and keep it short. A really good tip is leveraging other funders and partnerships. So one thing no funder wants to see is a request for 100% of the funding for a project. So we recently got an application for a beekeeping enthusiast society at the University of Toronto for $7,000, which is their full operating budget. And we know they were getting other funding, and we declined the application just because it's a real undesirable, and you want to leverage other funding that you have as much as possible. And it's really easy if you get $5,000 to turn that into $15,000. So I know there was an example in Memorial about $5,000. They turned it into 15, and it's actually really easy to leverage funding. So for example, if UNBC ends up getting the Epicure grant, it's easy to go to the university and say, hey, so we've got this grant, we're wondering about doing a press release to the university, and we're wondering if the university would match the contribution. And then in terms of the amount of funding that you're requesting, you want to make it seem like as small of a piece of the pie as possible. So you want to do sort of full cost accounting. So if you have volunteer time, add that in as monetary time and sort of make it look like you're requesting 20%, even if from a monetary perspective that's actually like 50% of your donation. And sort of you have in-kind partners, so if the grants department is doing a bunch of work for you, value their time appropriately.
And just to give you guys a bit of a really quick example, we had to match funds for the Vancouver Foundation to work with VIU and UNBC, and we've actually leveraged about twice the amount of the actual money we received through the project because so much has happened, and so we're writing a midterm report to let them know about all of the great things that have happened, just to keep our funders in the loop and to share out like what the actual impact has been. And the hope there is to continue the relationship.
Yeah. Next thing about writing a proposal is just be passionate and tell your story. It's a good story. With CFSP, you work in sustainability, you're a student, you're developing all of these leadership skills, and you're creating a really positive impact for students. So tell your story, be passionate about it, be emotional. And if you're seeking funding for an organization, talk about the outcomes and the impacts for clients as opposed to the organization itself. So if I see an application for, Meal Exchange wants to fund core funding, but Meal Exchange wants funding to support 6,000 student participants for Triggery who are going out and having this positive experience, looks a lot nicer. Be specific about your needs and why they're needed. And do full cost accounting, as I mentioned. So what do you need funding for, and why is it important? So if you're talking about funding for staff, like I need funding for staff time to run this program. I need supplies to do this for the kitchen and that. Then write well and get help. One tip that I've gotten for writing grants that I found is really effective is write like you're having a conversation. And if you're working in pairs, you can easily ask whoever you're working with, what do you want to say, and basically just take notes, because oftentimes it's great to sort of read an application that sounds like a conversation and sounds like something a real person would say, as opposed to like really flowery academic language. So we've got a couple grant applications that have come in and look like someone has basically gone to thesaurus.com and upgraded every word, and that's not a positive. So we write in sort of a simple language that's appropriate for your funder and sort of flows like a conversation. We've included a link here to Hemingway.com, which basically eliminates any flowery language from your application and sort of looks at what's necessary language and what's unnecessary language. That's a good thing that can help you. And then you also have amazing resources through MX and SYC that can help. So like Sarah's an experienced grant writer and can maybe help that and sort of give a read through your application.
Totally. And just to jump off the Hemingway app, you should be writing at about a grade 10 level, which basically means that it's shorter sentences and that the individual will want to continue reading.
Mm-hmm. So again, it's like it's a resume or cover letter. You want to keep someone engaged. You don't want to scare them off, and if you scare them off, they can actually just stop reading, especially if they're getting a lot of application. Next thing, for once you've written your proposal and you've got it sort of proofread and you're ready to send it in, and then follow up. So if you do get funding, always say thank you, and it's really important to sort of maintain that positive relationship. One of the worst things you can do is get a grant and then do nothing to the funder, because the funder's never going to want to fund you again. Where feasible, try and do a report that sort of summarizes what happened with the funding, so what you were able to do with it and why it was positive that you got funding and smart for you to get funding in the future. And be aware that a lot of grants do have a reporting process, so you're going to have to submit receipts, usually itemized receipts, sometimes a summary of the event. It's always good to include photos. Photos make things sort of personal and nice. Especially if you have some really awesome photos. So, for example, with the Epicure grant, you have a really nice photo of Melanie holding the potato heart. Was a really great find and really something that I think the funder is going to look at and be like, oh my god, this is a real person. I should fund them. Be aware of failures as sort of keys to success down the line. So, like, every failure is a learning opportunity. So even if you got a grant and your project didn't end up being successful, it's still good to follow up with the funder and say, it didn't work out exactly as planned, but we were able to do this and we learned this from that, and going forward we're able to do a lot more. So even if you do fail, don't be afraid to sort of reach out again. And I've included a link here to the failure reports that Engineers Without Borders sort of pioneered, and they're really examples of how you can learn from failure. And then just being aware of transition and that you're not going to be here forever. Sort of keep those contacts alive. So keep a record of who you applied to for funding, what the response was, and keep your communications so that someone can sort of read them in the past and look at, oh, so this is how they talk to them. And if you get like old grant applications that were successful, that's a really good starting point for the next year's grant application. And where possible, use a transition-proof email address. So you have your SYC email addresses that are university-based. Those are great things to communicate with because they look professional, and down the line, if the funder wants to follow up, they're following up with an email address that they know will be responsive next year. Okay. So are there any questions or comments about the process side of how to write an application, or is there any specific inquiries about that sort of stuff?
And I think just to jump on what James is saying, like this is applicable for everyone, whether it be a sponsorship, whether it be a professor, whether it be the students' union or a foundation. You know, just start with their needs. So awesome. Thanks, SJ. Really appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much. Sorry.
No worries. SJ actually had a funder come to the garden the other day, and there was a 6-year-old kid who was playing with her, and it just like everyone was so happy about the whole situation. So,
so going back to the photos, if you can actually capture that moment, is something that can really help you down the line. So if you're working with a community garden and you have kids coming by, like we had a children's day with our garden with the Early Learning Center on campus, those are great to include in any future fundraising communications because cute kids and gardens and So bring cameras, especially if you're doing any sort of product sponsorship. So for example, Camino is a sponsor of our summit coming up, and they're a really amazing manufacturer of organic fair trade chocolates. And if we can get photos of delegates enjoying that chocolate, it just sort of creates a really positive report back. Okay. Seeing there aren't any questions, are there any like challenges or roadblocks that you come across that you maybe want some help from other people here about how to address?
One thing I'd like to ask is kind of how to circumnavigate. I know we've had issues here dealing with our 2 student unions this summer here at Memorial. One of the issues has been not getting the responses with a large turnover. We had really good relationships, and just trying to. I know you mentioned about getting things into a policy and getting things into like long-standing agreements and bylaws. What's the best first step to take with that, other than approaching the executive people? Those are the people. We've tried going from top down, and now we're kind of at a spot of working bottom up.
Okay.
That's a different approach.
So if you don't want to work top down, I've tried like critical mass approaches and found them to be successful. So building support from other groups so you can kind of approach together, and if you build enough of a critical mass that they have to pay attention, that can sometimes help.
Especially at council meetings where they have to be there and responsive.
And I mean, if it's the executives that are approaching the board members, who are students most of the time, and getting support from board members who will be there to have the ongoing conversation, and their lower level staff and their volunteers, and sort of a bottom-up movement that gets to that critical mass where they have to respond. Executives are people, and people sometimes aren't the most reliable, so if you build up enough support within their own base, can be really effective for getting at them.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. It's just been trying to figure out some different strategy. I think partnering up with some other groups and trying to get everybody to get the ball rolling at once might be just the push everything needs right now. We've had really great success.
And I mean, go to them as much as possible.
Yeah, because we've had really good success with the grad student union. With getting the sustainability office to contact them on our behalf. If we're CC'd on an email with the sustainability office, we get emails back right away. If we send it from our own, we don't get replies. So it's trying to figure out how to navigate different ones and try to make a long-standing relationship.
Yeah. And that's definitely a good approach, so leveraging other relationships. So I know when I've needed a student union to respond right away, getting it sent through the student life office or an office that actually has a little bit more jurisdiction to motivate them can be helpful.
I think also just positioning yourselves as food experts, because often the students' union are responsible for connecting with the food service provider or having those initial meetings and might not know much. So positioning yourself as something that you actually have something that they need and require, and they'd appreciate that expertise.
Yeah, demonstrate your value. Talk about how you can benefit them and sell yourself as a positive as opposed to sort of an inconvenience that they have to work through. So you're not just a meeting that benefits you, it's a meeting that benefits them.
Any other questions that are coming up? I've got a general question that I think might affect all of you, maybe, but if there's other things that are popping up from your campuses. Okay, I'm wondering with you guys, like how you feel your events would transition to fundraisers rather than just these open events, and if that has come in, like the harvest parties and memorials hosting like a big fish fry where they'll use money from the community garden, or Dalhousie is having a orientation week, open, and you guys are doing a lot of the legwork helping with getting the local organic produce for that, or UNBC, starting up a community kitchen or that sort of thing, or the farmers market, which I think is cost neutral. Any thoughts there about how would you like those to be fundraisers, or would you like those to be neutral events without thinking about money?
For us, those events are fundraisers, but they are fundraisers for self-sustaining those projects and not maybe not ourselves. So for the UFM, we do have planned to pub nights. Pub nights is how we fundraise for clubs at UMBC. It's just how it goes. So we have 2 pub nights, one in each semester, and we're hoping for about $300 a pop. And that's basically the additional funds we need to break even at the end of the next year for the UFM. So, I mean, that's basically what we try to do. We've had other ideas come up from vendors, that doing like a big potluck or type thing, but reaching critical mass, I think, is an issue for us.
I think pub nights are actually a really good fundraising event for students, and something that doesn't necessarily have to be tied to the organization itself. So, for example, I used to work for a sexual education center, and we were fundraising for a mental health charity, and the event itself was just a pub night. Like, it didn't actually have to be tied to mental health. So we labeled it Sex Pub, and of course it sold out in 10 minutes, and we raised $5,000, but having events that are really approachable and generalizable.
Yeah, maybe ways to make more money, but ours have never made more money than that. So.
You can try, like, within pub nights, doing raffles can sometimes be successful. So if you get product donations, you can have a raffle within your pub night, and finding different ways to fundraise outside of admission can be useful.
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
But I mean, if you're having success with a $300 fundraiser, that's great. And pub nights also are great meetup opportunities and sort of help you to build capacity and allow your volunteers to socialize, and that's a really great thing to have. So wanting to keep those events accessible is really good.
Do you guys have, I think at UMBC you guys have a pretty good relationship with your guys' local brewery, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
One of the things we've been discussing, like I work for the Kitty Video One here, as potential fundraisers, it's like a mutually beneficial thing, was at some different events at bars offering like a $5 tasting of all of their beers, like a quick little sample thing where they would just donate the product, but we could keep the revenue on it. So it got brand recognition out for them, supported the local product, but allowed the profits to come back to support the group, whatever organization. So it kind of hits 2 things, like they donate not a whole lack of a lot of product, but just enough to get you by for the evening. But enough that, you know, they're getting a lot of great advertising out of it, and you can still gain some money, and it's kind of fun for people. It's not like an extra huge expense. If you're going out to have a couple of beers anyways, you know, $5 to try a couple things out. It's a cool experience.
Yeah. That's a great idea. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, I would go to that.
Yeah, totally.
I go to all of them.
Yeah.
I've seen those photos too, Mel.
I won the ugly sweater party last year.
Ooh, okay. I
Yeah.
would mention that beer sponsors are sort of like the holy grail of product sponsors, and they can be a bit difficult, but if you can get them and you have those connections, use them, because those are really fun.
We usually do them at a downtown pub at close, so it's all going to be through our student union pub, so also working with them to see if they'd be amenable to it, which I think they would be, so that's actually pretty viable for us.
You're partnering with the student union on a pub night, getting them to sort of sponsor the event, and their sponsorship being covering part of their costs can be a really good way to increase the amount of funds that you're raising through a pub night. So looking at other organizations that can cost share it can be helpful. Yeah, so in that case, you're not really raising more revenue from admissions, but you're lowering your cost of operation.
Okay.
So it's just just past the hour. Any other big questions that are coming up? I know there's a lot of resources, and James is an incredible resource and source of information. So this will be an ongoing document and conversation. But any thoughts now that would be useful to raise?
I think what I was really looking for was external funding opportunities, because I'm aware of what we have on campus, and I am going to look into more of the academic offices, actually. That was a really good idea. But I think external funding opportunities is like a new venture that I wanted to undertake, that I was hoping to get out of this call.
Yeah, so we've included a list of certain external funders, so like community foundations are a good one, so finding the community foundation for your local region can be a good funder. We've included Epicure, Starbucks, TD as good external funders, and then it's good to sort of ask your student union or your student life department what fundraising resources they're aware of, because it tends to be very region specific, so looking at what other groups have done in the past. So one thing I always do when I'm hosting a new event and I want to look at who are potential funders, look at who other people are getting funding from, and look at what relationships already exist around your area. So look around and see who else people are getting money from, and then think about knocking on their door and see what you can get out of that.
Totally, and that's usually pretty, like even on Meal Exchange's website, you'll see the list of our sponsors. So if you check out the local food bank, the local like farmers markets in your region, or bigger foundations or community organizations in BC or in your region, then you can kind of see, like, they'll likely have a list of all of their sponsors, gold, silver, and bronze. And the idea would be not to take funding away from them, but open the pockets of those others. So, if you're working closely with an organization that has links and opportunities, feel free to connect with them and ask if it would be possible to link things out. And just exciting heads up, the one thing I think we didn't talk about in this funding was timelines. So often grants, you kind of put them off, and then 2 days before,
you're rushing
to put them in. So try to give yourself enough time, and I will say that right before I say that the TD Friends of the Environment grant is due on the 15th of July. But as James says, it can be self-led, but I mean, if that is of interest to folks, that's something we can talk through. Awesome.
Okay, well, unfortunately, I have to hop off onto another call for the National Student Food Summit, so I'm going to duck out of the room, but I hope you guys enjoyed this chat, and if you have any follow-up questions, you can feel free to email me. I'm just james@mealexchange.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, James. Please put all of this together, and you're getting some thanks.
All right.
So, yeah, you're going to have a round of applause.
That's great.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. And I think this is a really important conversation to continue happening, and we can have it during our individual check-ins, or if you find things, especially if you're looking for funding and you hear about something that might either be national or your academic professor has connections in some other part of Canada, like please post it on the Facebook page because maybe Jada and someone at DAL is actually working on a project on Vancouver Island, or those sort of things might pop up. So yeah.
Okay, great. Awesome.
Thanks
All right,
so much.
well, take care.
All right, guys, thanks so much, and we'll send around these notes to follow up, and see you guys sometime really soon.
Okay.
Have a good one.
Bye.